Hi, preview staffers. Welcome back to what will now be our foreign language module. This is usually the second module that I do or that you can transition to, but it's really up to you in the order that you want to learn. So, without further ado, let's jump into foreign language. Now, I know you guys didn't get a chance to cover this in class. I know you focused on general ideas of placement in English and chem and math, which is fine. So this one's going to be a little bit longer. I'm going to take a little bit more time to make sure that we're covering all of the important points of foreign language placement. But make sure you write down your questions, same thing as the last module, and we'll make sure to cover and address any of those concerns or confusion when we're in class reviewing everything in 2 weeks. So how I'd like to approach foreign language placement is breaking it down into 3 different sections for you. So the first part is going to be understanding the languages and the sequencing, which is really important if I'm going to be able to teach you anything else beyond that. So proficiency and placement don't make sense if you don't understand the structure of the language sequencing at UF. So we are going to spend some time there. Then we're going to move into understanding proficiency and colleges. So this is a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily fall under the idea of placement, but because foreign language is so often, or the reason we're talking about foreign language is so often tied to whether or not a student needs to meet proficiency for a certain college, it's important to know what proficiency actually means and also what colleges are going to have some sort of foreign language proficiency requirement that is obviously going to be related to what we're speaking about. Then, of course, the last thing is understanding placement, which is, of course, what we're actually the whole module is supposed to be dedicated to. So we're just building on our knowledge to be able to get to that point and have a good conversation about placement in relation to foreign language. So let's start with our first part, understanding languages and the sequencing. We have a lot of foreign language options at UF. It's really exciting, actually, that students can come in and take any number of different languages and meet their proficiency requirement or just study the language in general. More variety than usually what the students are even aware of. So it's important, especially if a student is talking about maybe taking a language and they're possibly defaulting into ones that they're very familiar with, which is going to be the ones that you would think Spanish, French, German, the ones that a lot of students will speak through their high school classes. It's important to make sure that we're educating them on all the other options that are available because you just never know what language might really excite a student that they might want to study but just not know that they have access to when they're at UF. Now, not all of these languages are offered at UF in the fall. Some of them are offered every once in a while. It depends on if we have instructors. So just make sure that this list isn't fully comprehensive, but most of these languages are actually going to be taught in the fall this year. So this is a pretty good list of what you would see if you were looking in the preview workbook. Language terminology is really important if we're going to understand the foreign language requirements. So the 1000 level tend to be what we would call introductory sequencing. 2000 level classes are going to be intermediate sequences or the intermediate sequence, and then 3000 levels is going to be the advanced sequence. It's pretty basic, pretty easy to understand, but it's important to kind of understand those steps because that is going to play a part when we start talking about the where proficiency starts to happen. Now, most languages at UF are going to be represented in this way that you can see in the PowerPoint. So you've got the XXX, which is supposed to be a stand-in for any number of different prefixes to the numbers, and then we've got our 1130 and then our 1131. That tends to be what most languages are going to be, is some sort of prefix 1130 and then prefix 1131, and that's going to be the introductory sequence for that language. There are a couple times where there's a variation on that. Sometimes you'll see 1120 or 1121. That tends to be more commonly seen if a student is bringing in a language through dual enrollment from a state college. But we have a couple classes at UF that also follow that same pattern. But for the most part, it's going to be 1130, 1131. Most language classes, that 1130 component is going to be, so that first semester or first part of the sequence of the language is going to be taught in the fall. This is especially true for any of our languages that are less popular than others, just because they don't have the availability or the money to be able to have it start every term. So, for example, potentially, I'm trying to think of a good language. So let's say like Dutch or something, or Turkish. So language that maybe isn't going to be as popular, or not going to have as many students wanting to take it. So that means that if a student did want to start in those languages, they would take it in the fall semester, because that's when the first term is going to be offered. Um, so it's just important to make sure that if a student is coming to you and saying, hey, I'm really thinking about studying this language, but I'm not sure, we would encourage them to probably start that in the fall, because the alternative is that they would have to wait a whole year before they could maybe jump in and start trying out that language at UF. Now, most 1130, 1131 courses are going to be 5 credits each. And some are going to be 4, but for the most part, they're going to be 5, which is a big number, but we'll talk about how we can kind of work with that in an upcoming slide. Now, it's okay for students to start into a higher level part of the sequence than the 1000s. Some students are going to bring in credit for even higher than that. They're going to bring in credit for intermediate classes through incoming credit. And so it's okay for them to start maybe in a 2000 or 3000 level language course based on their placement, based on their background in the language. Now, there's one language at UF that offers a 3-semester sequence. So on the previous slide, we talked about how the language sequence for introductory is going to most likely be 1130 and 1131, and that's the introductory sequence. 5 credits each, we're done. There's one language at UF that offers a 3-semester sequence, and that is Latin. Though, not to be confusing at all, they do also have a 2-semester sequence too. So while there is a 3-semester sequence, which is like, I think the numbers are like LAT 1120, 1101 and 1104. Don't ask me how those numbers got created. I don't do that. It's just what it is. We go with it. But the accelerated Latin is actually LAT 1130 and 1131. Again, mirroring that 1130, 1131 that almost all the languages have. So there just is one language that has a 3-semester sequence to meet that introductory level. My understanding is that a lot of students will take that if they're interested in Latin but don't necessarily have any background in it. It tends to be kind of a nice, a little bit slower paced buffer for that language, but that's all relative to the student and what it is that they want to take and how fast they want to take it. So why do you need to know about foreign language placement? The obvious answer is that students are going to take foreign language courses. It could be because they are interested in learning about the language, or any number of different reasons, but you need to know about it because our students are going to take this. Students are going to commonly have a language background, and so we want to make sure that we're setting them up for success. Not every student is going to come in and just need to start at the very beginning of a language. We need to know about placement because there are going to be many students that are going to start somewhere later in the sequencing in any number of different languages that we offer. It's also important that we know about it because of that foreign language proficiency requirement for some of the colleges that we talked about earlier in the module. We have a lot of language majors and minors, so that list of languages that I showed you earlier, about half of those languages are actually offered as a major at UF, and then almost all of them are offered as a minor in some variation at UF, which is amazing, and we have a lot of students who are going to want to pursue those, so we need to be knowledgeable about how to work with students with foreign language. And then, of course, language skills are indeed super sweet, which is a quote from one of my favorite movies. If you guys want to try to figure it out, you get super sweet bonus points. The movie's a little bit older now, but a sequel of it came out recently. Dun dun dun. See if you can figure it out. When would a student take a foreign language class his or her first term? So this is a really good question, and this is something that I think, depending on your background, your personal experiences with foreign language, your answer can kind of differ, but we want to make sure that we all have a a consistent answer across the entire staff or class and the advisors as well to make sure that we're giving students the best information that's not necessarily biased by our own experiences. So a student might take a foreign language class their first term if they're thinking about building or pursuing a major or minor in the language, or they just want to build up their language skills and become fluent or proficient. Those are wonderful things. Having a language background can be incredibly valuable to students if for being competitive for the job market or just being able to connect and communicate with more people in the world, which is very valuable. Let's say they might want to take it their first semester because of the foreign language proficiency requirement, which we talked about is required for some colleges. And it's a language they studied in high school, so they want to make sure that they don't lose any knowledge if they wait to take something for like a semester or a year. Or it could just be that you have a student who likes studying languages. Those students do exist. I am jealous of them. I don't have an affinity for it, but I think languages are so interesting. And if I could study them and if it came a little bit more naturally to me, I absolutely would do so. So some students, we just want to encourage that passion that they might have for the language, for language learning. And kind of going off of that, this is a really important thing that I want all of you to take to heart, because there's sometimes a stigma where we fall into a trap of discouraging students from taking something because it's a lot of credits and we don't want the students to be overwhelmed. And so I know that comes from a place of compassion and just concern for the students' success their first term. But please do not discourage students from taking a language class simply because it's 5 credits. Of course, we want to take that into consideration when helping to build their schedule. If, like, let's say they already have 12 or 13 hours, taking 5 credits on top of that is probably not a good idea. But I don't want to discourage or just dismiss the language entirely if a student can build it in a reasonable way that allows them to then start taking these language classes. If they want to learn a language, they need to really start as soon as possible, because that's something that you have to build on semester to semester. And taking it out of the mix right away can be detrimental, because sometimes it can delay their ability to start it for almost a whole year. So have those conversations, make sure students are interested in a language, of course, if they're going to take it their first semester, but we definitely do not want to go out of our way to discourage it. That's just not what we want to do. So if we're looking at the step-by-step sequencing of Spanish, because Spanish is, like I said, going to be one of our more popular languages. You're going to have a lot of students who are going to come in and want to learn this language and take additional courses in it. So it's important to understand, going up through advanced, what that looks like. So as you can see, we've got our introductory sequence, our 1000 level, which is Spanish 1130 and SPN 1131. We move then into intermediate, which is SPN 2200 and 2201, so intermediate Spanish 1 and 2. And then we have kind of like a buffer class almost in there. SPN 2240, which is intensive communication skills, is a 2000 level class that's designed to help make sure that the students' oral skills in the language are where they need to be before going into advanced. Because what we found, or what Spanish Department has found, is that students will go through SPN 2200 and 2201 and be very strong maybe in the reading and writing, but the oral skills are really, I think, where some students really struggle. 2240 helps build in an additional conversation component so that you're really hitting home that importance and focusing on that and that alone before moving into that advanced level class, which is SPN 3300. Now, French's, as you can see, French's trajectory is actually very similar when we go through the sequencing. French 1130, 1131, which is the introductory sequence, looks exactly the same as Spanish. Now, this is where it changes a little bit. You'll notice that there is no intensive language course listed here for French. What they did is they actually took that class and they built in a little bit of extra work into FRE 2220 and 2221 so that they're now 4 credits each as opposed to 3, which is what it was for Spanish. But they're now 4 credits each. And they have that extra additional conversation piece built into each intermediate class. And then, of course, after FRE 2221 is FRE 3300, which is the advanced, or as it's called here, grammar and composition French course. Now, there is another alternative to go through these, this sequencing. FRE 1130 and 1131, that's great if a student's starting kind of right from the very beginning in that language. But there is another option called FRE 1134 Accelerated French Review, which is a 5-credit course that combines FRE 1130 and FRE 1131 into one semester. So it condenses everything into like 7 weeks for French 1, 7 weeks for French 2. So it's accelerated, but it's a great review for students who have some background in French. And when you'll recommend this to students is going to be determined by their high school background, you know, what they've taken. And you're going to have a chart in the preview workbook to help you with that so that you can make good recommendations at preview while students are registering for their classes. You'll also notice that FRE 1134 then goes directly into FRE 2220. So whether you're taking the 1130, 1131 sequence or doing this class, either way it's going to help prepare you and allow you to move into that next step, which is FRE 2220. And last but not least, for our specific sequencing that I want to talk about is German. Now you'll notice that German, this is set up a little bit differently, and that's because their language classes are a little different. You've got our standard GER 1130, 1131 on the left, right, or just our introductory German sequence, very common. And then on the right, you've got GER 1125 and GER 1126. This sequence is called the Discover German sequence, and I'm going to talk about it on the next slide a little bit more about the differences between the two sequence options. But the important thing to recognize right now is that either one is an acceptable way to get to GER 2200, which is Intermediate German 1. So it doesn't matter which sequence you do, either one is going to prepare and lead you to Intermediate German 1. And then, of course, after that, we've got Intermediate German 2, which the number jumps a little bit, so GER 2240, but again, I'm not in charge of that, so we're going to go with it. So now that we understand how the sequencing works and the languages that are taught at UF, let's actually talk about proficiency and the colleges that require it. FLP, which is what I'm using as the acronym of Foreign Language Proficiency, applies to, I love that question mark. Can we just take a moment and appreciate just the oddness of that question mark and how it looks? It's just delightful. Okay, I'm over it. I'm done. So does every student need to take a foreign language? And the answer is no. No, of course not. Some colleges require students to meet proficiency in a foreign language. Some colleges require students to meet proficiency or to take a specific language class, which we'll talk about. Some colleges require language proficiency, but then also have an alternative option to take the requirement. For example, like a quantitative option, such that the College of Journalism and Communications offers. But no, not every student is required to take a foreign language at UF. Now, what does it mean to be proficient in a language? So the best way to probably describe this, or the simplest way, is that you understand the introductory sequence of the language. So when we were looking back, if we look back at the beginning of the module, when we talked about what the introductory sequence was, which was most likely those 2 semesters of the 1000 level coursework, that was what we would describe as the introductory sequence. That sequence is what it means to be proficient in a language. However, it does not mean that you have to take a certain number of credits, and it does not mean that you have to take a certain number of classes. So even though if you have a student who starts in a language at the very beginning and would take like an 1130, 1131, and that would mean that it is 10 credits and that would mean that it is 2 classes, and that meets language proficiency, it's not necessarily the only way the student can do that. A student can start anywhere in the sequence. They can start beyond the introductory sequence, and any of those options are going to meet language proficiency because it's not a certain number of classes or a certain number of hours. It's just getting to that finish line of understanding the concepts and the language that it was taught in that introductory sequence. Now, proficiency, can be met by a lot of different ways. It can be met by completing the introductory language sequence, as I just described. It can be met with passing your AP IB ACE foreign language exams. If a student takes a foreign language exam in any of those 3 credit by exam areas and earns the passing score, then they will meet the language proficiency automatically, because there's no language exam that gives credit to a student for anything lower than 1131, which is going to complete that language proficiency requirement, or meet that language proficiency requirement, I should say. So just something to keep in mind. Another option for students to meet proficiency is to take FLATS, which is our language exam that we offer on campus. that students can sign up for through the Teaching Center. And if they take it, which is it's an electronic exam that you take on the computer, if they earn the necessary score, then they might place out of the language requirement or place into a later language, whatever it might be. But flats is the way to go if you don't have incoming credit and aren't planning on taking the language sequence just straight up. And then, of course, the students can test out of the language with the department if they have a strong background or fluency. Now, flats is actually very different than SAT-2, which is the language exam that we used to use. The SAT-2 was very limited because we could only test students for a couple of the more popular classes to see where they placed in to check on their proficiency. That's not the case anymore. Flats offers languages like you wouldn't believe, like tons, pretty much anything I could think of. It offers the option for students to select that and then try to test out of their language proficiency requirement by taking the exam. So I would strongly encourage you to talk to your students about using it if they have a background in a language, because it might really be helpful to figure out their placement. So which colleges are actually the ones that have more language proficiency requirements? So the big one, as I'm sure you all remember from the college presentations, is the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. We have a language proficiency requirement. So does the College of Journalism and Communications. However, College of Journalism and Communications also offers an alternative option for students, which is called the quantitative option. So students, instead of taking a language course or meeting that language proficiency, can instead take, I want to say it's about 8 to 10 hours, I think, of classes that are like statistics, computer science, accounting, a little bit more in that vein. And if that's interesting to you, then that's awesome. I would maybe check that out instead of the language requirement. But you don't have to make that decision right this second. It's just important to know that there's options. The School of Construction Management requires that students complete an introductory Spanish class, which one kind of depends on who you talk to. But I would refer to construction management for any questions that you might have or the students might have about the language class that they have to take, which is specifically Spanish. We're not going to go into that, but that would be the class that they need to take if they were thinking about majoring in that particular field. And then, of course, the College of the Arts. So I don't know if you remember, I don't know if we delved into this too much during the College of the Arts college presentation, but the College of the Arts offers different types of degrees, whether it's a Bachelor's of Fine Arts, or which is a BFA, or just a Bachelor of Arts, or I'm trying to remember what the music one is, but there's different options. But if a student is choosing to pursue a degree in the Bachelor of Arts only, no other kind of trappings, then they may need to take a specific language. So I would refer them to the College of the Arts advisor just to double check to make sure they know what they have to do to graduate. Now, understanding placement. Foreign language placement is applicable to any student who wants to take a language at UF and has a previous background in that particular language. So placement obviously doesn't apply to a student who comes in and says, I really want to take Arabic. I've never taken it before. I know nothing about it. What do I do? Placement doesn't apply to that student. They're just going to start at the beginning of the sequence, and we're going to wish them well as they go off to do it. Language placement has to do with students who have a background in it and then, of course, want to take that language or want to try to meet proficiency with that language. That's what placement applies to. Now, what do we use to evaluate placement? If we're trying to figure out where a student should start in a language, where do we go? High school background is going to be something that we're going to use. We're going to use their credit by exam scores like we talked about. We're going to use dual enrollment if they've taken any dual enrollment classes. We're going to use FLATS, which is that, again, that exam that you can take through the Teaching Center to determine placement at UF. And then, of course, we're going to use their personal background. Many of our students come in bilingual or trilingual. They speak other languages. So if they want to build on those language skills and take something in an area that they already have a strong background in, we're going to take that into account too. And most likely departments are going to help them find an alternative option that's going to suit more with what the student needs. Now, if a student is bringing in incoming credit, and as we talked about already, just to kind of recap, that means the student is going to meet the language proficiency requirement by default if they're bringing in a passing score in a language exam through AP, IB, or ACE. But let's say the student wants to continue. They want to learn more of that language. They want to maybe get a major or a minor in it, or just study it because they're interested in it, which is fine. Now, if a student wants to continue, the student can just take the next course in the sequence. So if, let's say, a student is earning credit for SPN 2200 through AP, which is Spanish, Intermediate Spanish 1, the student has the option to just move forward in the class and take SPN 2201, which is Intermediate Spanish 2. Or if they're not feeling as comfortable about their skills, or let's say they took the exam their junior year but they haven't had any language for a year, it is okay if they want to repeat the class that they earned credit for. So that second, or that class that they're moving past in the sequencing, it's okay if they want to repeat that. The department doesn't want them going an additional step down. So in the example we use with the student who already has SPN 2200 credit, we could say, okay, you could take SPN 2201, which is the next part of the sequence. You could retake SPN 2200 if you really didn't feel comfortable moving forward. But we're not going to tell a student, oh yeah, go back all the way to SPN 1131 and start there. That's just not conducive to the student's learning, and it's not what the departments want. So kind of as an option, like break it down a little bit differently. I'm a visual aid person. If we're looking at this and we're talking about Spanish, a student wants to study the language, again, which is different than meeting proficiency potentially. If the student wants to study a language in Spanish, we would recommend that they take the WebCape exam. The WebCape is a specific exam that the Spanish department uses to determine placement, not proficiency, but placement in Spanish. And the students can find this on the Spanish department's website. And it's also going to be available in the preview workbook in the foreign language placement section. It'll give you the link there of what the student needs to type in to find that. They're not going to take WebCape at preview, mind you, so we're going to do our best guessing as to figure out what to register them for, and if they have to adjust later, that's fine. But the big thing is going to be recommending that they take WebCape to help determine their placement in higher level classes. Now, if a student is fluent, then we would refer them to the department, because sometimes there are different classes for what we call heritage speakers. So sometimes students will come in and they'll be very strong speakers in a language, but maybe their reading and writing hasn't been as much of a focus for them, and so they lack that strength in those areas. Sometimes there are heritage speaker classes, which again are designed for students that have the language, but let's focus on the reading and writing component of what it is that you're studying. Now, if a student wants to meet proficiency, they could take, and they have a high school background, but they don't feel very strong about it, like maybe they only took like 1 or 2 years, they can take WebCape and then take the appropriate class that they place into. Or they can take the FLATS exam to see if they test out of the requirement. Now, the reason you cannot use WebCape to test out of the requirement entirely, to use it to meet proficiency, is because it's not a proctored exam. It's something that you take for like $10 online on your own, and so we can't use that as a determining factor to meet a requirement to graduate. You could pay someone, not that you would, but someone could pay, a student could pay somebody to take the exam for them through WebCape, which I guess maybe some people would do that with the admissions scandal going on, topical news, but a student isn't proctored, so we can't allow them to meet proficiency that way. FLATS is proctored through the Teaching Center, so a student can take the FLATS exam and use that to meet proficiency in that language. I apologize, I'm coughing a little. My throat's drying up from talking so much. Time to wrap it up. So if we're looking at French, it's going to be very similar, except that French doesn't have anything like WebCape that it uses to determine where a student might place in the language. Now again, we've got 2 different options here. If a student wants to study the language, so they want to move further in that language no matter whether they meet proficiency or not, they have a high school background, we would use the French placement chart in the workbook to be able to determine kind of our best guess of where they would start. If they're fluent, we would refer them to the department, because we would want the department to see maybe what would be the best class for them to start in. If they have any background in the French language at all, and all they want to do is just meet proficiency, then they just need to take the FLATS exam to determine placement, or to test out of the language requirement entirely. So depending upon what their score is, they might just place out of it and they're done, or they might place into, let's say, like the next part of the introductory sequence, like the second part, and then they would only have to take that one class and then they would be done. So FLATS can help us determine where a student should start based on that. And then, of course, we have all other languages, which is just as important as Spanish and French. So if we have students that come in and they want to take a language that's not French or Spanish and they have a background in it, we would most likely refer them to the departments after preview, of course, to meet with someone to talk about their language skills. If the student has like a very basic understanding of the language, they could always take the FLATS exam, like we talked about. It's offered in any number of different languages, so students can take it for pretty much any language you can think of. You can always refer them there, but if there is a department on campus, then I might have them talk with an advisor or an instructor there just to learn more about what that language is and maybe hopefully spark some additional interest. At preview, students are going to either register for the course based on his or her best guess, or they can wait until they contact the department and receive course recommendations. This is going to be up to the student, and I think we've talked about this in scheduling classes at a different point, but students are going to feel some students are going to feel completely okay with having a blank space on their schedule while they figure out what needs to be there. Other students are going to get incredibly twitchy about having any sort of space because they need to leave with a full schedule, whether it's the schedule they really want or not. So that's going to just have to be your best guess when working with the students that are going to fall under this category. And that concludes our foreign language proficiency module. I will see you in the math module, hopefully in just a little bit.